Okay, this is probably going to be two podcasts, but at least to start. Um, when you're looking at Chinese religions, and I used it in plural intentionally, you have to understand that China, and this is actually true in most of Asia, is that throughout Asia, what you find is there's religions and there's cosmologies, or if you want to, there's religions and there's belief systems. They're not separate, but they're not the same thing. Sorry if I'm making this confusing. This goes back to the idea that what you have basically two types of religions in the world. You have monotheistic systems, Christianity, Judaism, Islam are real good examples. And one of the basic logics is, if you would, they have the word or they had the answers. And so in their context, you don't have any need for other religions. And in fact, other religions are in competition with them. The whole issue we see over the last, 1,000 years in the Middle East and such. Um, and so in that context, uh, there's like one way of doing things, and you're either a believer or you're not. Now, this gets incredibly complicated because, of course, you can have monotheism within a religion. The wars of religion between the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Europe in I think it was 1600s or whatever it was, is a perfect case in point where you literally have folks within the same theological system going after each other. So monotheistic or monopolistic, if you want to think of it, religions are typical of much of the world. One of the ways you can generally see these is because these are religions which are going to have some logic of basically proselytization. The idea that you one of the agendas you have with a religion is your religion is mandated to grow by whatever the deity or whatever the motivating force is. And so what they're going to do is they as part of their marching orders or logic or whatever phrase you want to use, they have the responsibility, if you would, to go and convert folks that are of other religions to the religion that they have, since their religion is, quote, the only religion, unquote. So that missionaries is one of the sort of litmus test, flashing lights of a monotheistic religion. And that's just the way those systems work. So they're all in competition with each other, because if you're part of another religion, you're not part of their religion, then you're part of the wrong religion. By contrast, the Asian system, this is true of other areas too, but certainly in the Asian system, what you find is the religion is what we call a syncretic religious system. So what this means is you have multiple religions operating at the same time, and people tend to move around within them. The classic example is Japan. There's the kind of one we get to Japan is that Japanese are born Buddhist, they live Shinto, and when they pass away, they become Buddhist again. And what this means is Japanese during their life uh, move from two belief systems, Shintoism and Buddhism, and they use both. They're not committed to one to the exclusion of the other. And the two religions function. I wouldn't say they function in harmony necessarily, but they have learned to live with each other. The Chinese system is very much the same. The Chinese, as with the rest of East Asia and Southeast Asia, also is that Buddhism is sort of the religion that came into China. Ironically, it originally was a sort of monotheistic religion, and it had missionaries. The in-house religion that's part of the Chinese system is usually called Taoism, which is really sort of a tricky concept because, as with Shinto in Japan, Taoism really isn't a religion per se. It's sort of a packaged belief system. In fact, Taoism gets incredibly complicated when you get into it, because some aspects of Taoism deal divination, for example, that we mentioned before, that's Taoist. The idea of placement of feng shui, for example, that's Taoist. If you pray to various gods to make you healthy or to give your kids a good education, that's Taoism. Uh, And yet, on the other hand, there's another branch of Taoism which deals with basically drives for immortality, the idea of meditation to basically the same thing, achieve immortality. And so there's sort of intellectual Taoism, the Lao Tzu type Taoism. There's the very pragmatic Taoism of Chinese going to temples and praying for stuff because they want to make sure their job application gets accepted. So very sort of functional, practical, almost pragmatic Taoism. And so there's all these various types, and they're all part of the same. They're all labeled the same thing, but they're not part of a coherent belief system. And this would be exactly the same thing we're going to see when we get to Japan with Shinto. It's not. There's no book. There's no equivalent to the Bible or the Quran. There's nothing that basically says, okay, this is how it works. Um, Taoism tends to be very place specific. In other words, Taoism in one part of China is pretty radically different than Taoism in another part. So it's very localized. The intellectual version of Taoism, the philosophical Taoism of Lao Tzu and such, that tends to be very universalistic in the sense that it's the same regardless of where you are in Asia, especially in China, but also in Japan and Korea. Just to make life even more confusing, there's actually sort of a third semi-religious system. And I put that semi-religious, we'll see this a little bit later. And this would be Confucianism. Master Kung or Confucius set up a set of social precepts, long after Taoism and I guess actually, yeah, it's before Buddhism, are in place. And what happens is he sets them up as a set of guidelines for behavior. So if you would, a set of, moral social rules like we've seen before when we are talking about social values, those are largely Confucian. Having said that, what happens is when you get with this idea of the universal exam system, is scholars, since the goal of a scholarship, in China was to become a bureaucrat to work for the government, and Confucian values in the sense of, respect authority, et cetera, was sort of like the centerpiece of bureaucratic logic. Is what happens very quickly is that the folks that are involved in the bureaucracy and government make Master Kung and Confucius logic into sort of a third religion. This one becomes pretty much whacked when the People's Republic comes in 1949, since the People's Republic was adamantly opposed for a bunch of philosophical reasons with Confucianism as a religion. They weren't necessarily opposed to the fact that it sort of support Confucian values because, it would say, among other things, you've got to, respect the Communist Party because it's the guys in charge. But they weren't willing to deal with the Confucian religion, which had become over the 2,000 years, it sort of morphed into sort of a strange religion of the bureaucracy. The vast majority of the population never had anything to do with it. But if you were involved in the government or wanted to be involved in the government, you basically embraced Confucianism. Now, again, this is not in lieu of its alternatives. So someone who was going to a Confucian temple would also be going to Taoist temples and would certainly be doing Buddhist stuff also. So you end up with basically three religions, for a big chunk of Chinese history, at least the last 1,500 years, sort of running in parallel with each other. I'm not sure, sort of classic way to say this. Having said this, what you find is since Confucianism is based on Chinese values that pre-existed, he didn't come up with them, he just codified them. And since Taoism is basically sort of a almost anarchic collection of stuff, which again is traditional Chinese values, is there's a set of Chinese beliefs that predate all the religions, and they persist through the religions. And so what you find is especially Taoism and Buddhism, at some point or another, buy into the Chinese belief system. I think from a rather sort of cynical or pragmatic point of view, since Chinese believe these beliefs, if you said these beliefs aren't true, then you just weren't going to get any followers. You weren't going to convince people that these beliefs were false. So therefore, what you had to do was, if you want your religion to be embraced, is you have to embrace aspects of those beliefs to to make your religion more palatable, if you would, to the population, in the same way that Christianity takes on the idea of Christmas, which is a Roman belief, and it doesn't anything to do with the Testament per se. It becomes part and parcel of that as a way to make Christianity acceptable to a population which was not going to give up the idea of that particular, winter celebration. You just had to basically, if you were going to get accepted, you have to convert that celebration to something that basically you can put a spin on, if you want to think of it that way. So here's the Chinese beliefs. One of the really key one, and the Chinese see this in a fundamental way with almost everything, actually, to be honest, is sort of this idea of yin and yang. And if you ever look at the Tao symbol or the Daiji symbol, the circle with the sort of wiggles in it, with one portion's black and the other portion's white. The Chinese believe explicitly and implicitly that the world consists of almost Newtonian polar opposites. If you would, for everything, there's an equal opposite. Now, where this differs from and where this is an enormous difference for the sort of Euro-American belief system, is the Chinese believe that the position you actually want to be is the idea of balance. So you don't want too much of the white portion, you don't want too much of the black portion. What you want to be is right on the cusp between the two. And so, Chinese medicine, traditional medicine, for example, involves the idea of figuring out if someone's too much yin or too much yang, and then giving you, either massage or acupuncture, or acupressure therapy, or drugs, to basically move you to that center point between the two. So, and you see this a lot when this is why Chinese, and in fact throughout Asia, but especially in China, the idea of meditation. Meditation is balance to basically is to promote you to a position of balance, to put you back in the center. So you're not too much negative, you're not too much positive. Now that also means, too much happy, too much sad, dark, light, male, female, even, odd numbers, mountains, valleys, cold, heat, water. You can just go on and on. Basically, everything in the Chinese belief system has an opposite, and you don't want to be on one side or the other. Now, this is totally different than the sort of Euro-American concept, which is the idea that you want to be happy, you want to be this, you want to be that. In the Chinese concept, being happy means that at some point in the future you're going to be sad. What you really want to be is sort of neutral. Now, Americans would get really bothered by this as a general concept, which is one reason why American meditation doesn't have any of the same goals that I can think of that Chinese does. So yin and yang is absolutely central. And when you look at anything in China, you have to deal with this. My wife, for example, the way she dressed would literally be based on a balance of yin and yang. So the colors that you wear and even the textures that you have would be based on balancing this stuff. When you go to a formal Chinese meal, or even relatively just normal dinner, a Chinese menu, if you want to think of it, is the idea of balancing yin and yang. You don't want a meal that's going to have too much spicy stuff or too much dull stuff. You don't want something that's too much salty or too much whatever. You want a meal that when it's done, it's balanced. Each individual, dish might be one thing or the other, but you don't want to go off one side or the other at the end of the meal. So whether it be emotions, whether it be food, whether it be the colors that you put in a house, everything is with this idea of balancing yin and yang. And if you understand that, then all of a sudden a huge amount of what you see in Asia makes sense, because yin and yang, or one form or another, is found throughout, at least East Asia, and certainly, I would think, at least from what I know, certainly in Southeast Asia too. So you've got to grasp this idea that people don't see things as extremes are bad. And this actually, if you think about it, it goes back and talk about business and such like that. This is why someone who's wealthy, people are always going to look at that rather ambivalently, because wealth is going to be temporary, one, and then too much wealth is not. That's throwing off too much yin or too much yang. I'm not sure which it would be. So it's not good inherently. And there's a whole whole system you can see. If you go to even a Buddhist temple, you'll find that people throw sticks. This is the I Ching. And so what you'll find is they're throwing sticks, which is on one hand theoretically sort of a Taoist thing to do, but it actually predates, sort of what we can call Taoism in its modern form. But what it's actually looking at is this idea of yin and yang, solids and broken, if you would, solids and empty space. And so you predict your future based on how this plays out. And that's the Ching that you can, in fact, you can even do that online from what I understand. I'm not sure it would work the same. Think of it anyways. What this also means that Chinese embrace the idea that change is a constant, trying to make things stay the same. And the Chinese system is silly. That's like trying to, get the ocean to stop moving or something like that. Change is actually just yin and yang succeeding each other, because even in the world system order, if you want to think of it that way, if there's too much yang, then the systems in the world will try to replace that with yin. So if you want to think tides in, tides out. So change is just the yin and yang that are always going to succeed each other. So you can never get something in a permanent sense. It's always going to be temporary. Success, failure, everything is just yeah, it's just change is a constant. And the Chinese just totally explicitly believe this. One of the other aspects of this is this idea of reincarnation, or more accurately, cycles of existence. Chinese really aren't too clear about how reincarnation occurs. When Buddhism comes into China, it makes this rather explicit, because the Buddhism that comes into China uses reincarnation as one of the, I don't know, selling points, if you would, to make the religion attractive. But the Chinese, for basically for thousands of years, have believed in the idea of cycles of existence. So it isn't really codified in the classic example you find in South Asia, in terms of reincarnation, whether it be Hindu or Buddhist or whatever. But the idea that you've been around once, you'll be around again, you're around now, is very much the Chinese sense. One thing you'll classically see in China is people bump into each other not having ever met. And if there's a rapport, they'll say, well, we must have known each other in a prior existence. And they're not being facetious. They're actually deadly serious about this. So cycles of existence are, they're a huge part of Chinese literature, again, dramas and such, but they're also something that people believe in explicitly, that you're around for a period of time. Again, change being what it is. You're born, you live, you die. And then some sort of process comes, and you re-enter the system, if you would. You're born again, you live again, you die again. Where it's a little bit different than the classic Hindu one, is that Chinese believe pretty explicitly that at some point people have some sort of vague sort of memory of their past lives, their past cycles of existence. So people won't know any details about it, but it's not uncommon for people to bump into someone and say, oh, like I said before, oh, we must have known each other before. And so people are comfortable with that, and it doesn't freak them out. A main part of the Chinese system, and again, it really wasn't codified until sort of Buddhism comes in, is this idea that the idea of karma, that good and bad things that you do will store up and basically are sort of in a savings account, in terms of, like a debit account or, whatever, where basically the things that you do that are good, and this is largely not only individually, but also, good for the family, good for the whatever, will help you in the next cycle of existence. Likewise, things that go bad are oftentimes seen to be reflective of something you did wrong in the last cycle of existence. So, for example, if something goes really bad, people will think that it's they must be paying their dues or their penance. I'm not sure what you want to use, because of something they did in the prior life. And so, it's not like I've got bad luck now because of something I've done now. I've got bad luck now because I'm finally paying the payment. I'm making the payment, if you would, on something I did in another existence. And likewise, doing good things. If you remember, I mentioned before in terms of status and prestige and values, the idea of doing good things for a community and such like that. One of the main reasons you do that is to build up karma, like if you would build up deposits that you can then cash in on in the next existence cycle. Now, one of the interesting parts of all this is again predating, sort of Taoism as a formal structure, is this idea of the Jade Emperor. Um, in Asia, what you find, the funny thing is South Asia really doesn't play this way. Anyways, in East Asia, what you find is that heaven exists, but it's not really clearly defined who is in heaven. On a certain assumption, pretty much everyone gets there, unless they've done something really dumb, at which point they end up one of the hells. But basically, heaven is where people hang out till they come back on their next existence cycle. So it's almost like a hotel, I guess, for lack of a better term. Now, the interesting thing about the Asian version of heaven is that heaven is like a cleaner, better dressed, better functioning version of Earth. Or if you would, Earth is like a real crappy, bad copy of heaven. So heaven isn't seen as something, it's not like the Judeo-Christian concept where it's just seen as something permanent and it's a place that you're going to, once you get there, you stay there and, basically, I suppose for what I understand, a sort of eternity is perfect. The Asian heaven it's like living a life you live now. That the weather might be better, but you still have to deal with bureaucracy and all the other stuff like that in heaven. The guy in charge of heaven is the Jade Emperor. Now, Chinese theological tradition has the Jade Emperor being around thousands of years before the first real emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, shows up. I suspect in some way, given that guy was really clever, it's not by accident that he chose that title. I would be willing to bet that he sort of figured if he gave himself a title and sort of made himself look like a Earth version of the Jade Emperor, as the people would buy into the guy and the idea that he's in charge. It's pretty practical, from a political standpoint. It's a clever piece of symbolism. And so, anyways, there's the Jade Emperor in heaven, and there's the Empress and everyone else. And what you find is that folks that are hugely good, I guess, for lack of a better term, or score lots of karma points, will end up in the bureaucracy in the Jade Emperor's heavenly entourage. So in the Chinese belief system, what you find is you're going to find Master Kung, i.e. Confucius, is going to be there. A Buddha is going to be there. Lao Tzu is going to be there. So they're all like advisors or consultants, or if you would, to the Jade Emperor in heaven. So, yeah. So, I mean, Jade Emperor is an interesting concept. The Japanese and Chinese, Koreans have the same thing, but Chinese one's most explicit. Now, if you ever want to see this played out, read Whaley's Monkey King, The Journey to the West, where he actually sort of parodies, or, Wu Cheng-en is the actual author, but they actually sort of do a parody, but also sort of a social commentary critique of the Chinese belief system. And at least the first whole part has to deal with the supernatural monkey dealing with the Jade Emperor and the folks in heaven. In fact, that's sort of the main dynamic of what goes on with that whole thing. So the Jade Emperor was very much and very is a part of the Chinese belief system. I'm not sure how the Communist Party from into the early 21st century just sort of said, well, that's a Chinese belief. And they just sort of stayed away from it. Under Mao, for example, they closed all the temples and you couldn't have images and stuff like that. But the interesting thing is people didn't destroy them, they just hid them. Once Mao's gone and, sort of more rational view of things, then all of a sudden pop, this stuff shows up again. You see this classically in Chinese New Year's. The idea that you're going to, ask blessings of the Jade Emperor and of the folks in heaven for the next year is the basic premise of Chinese New Year's. The other set of beliefs, numerology is a huge thing well, actually, even more so in South Asia. Indians are famous for the amount of numerology that they do in the system, especially Hindu. But in East Asia also, numerology is a huge thing. Now, again, it gets enfolded within Taoism, but it predates Taoism. So you can go back, into the Shang and Zhou period, which is, pre-Taoist in the sense that the religion isn't organized yet. And you find an enormous amount of time and effort is spent fiddling with numbers. The number of things that you see, number of the birds that fly overhead, or, anything that can be counted becomes a source of divination and interpretation to either predict the future or understand what's going on around you or something like that. Um, you can see this classically today, despite the Communist Party, and even during even now, is that if you go to buy a phone and start up a new phone with one of the carriers, what you're going to find, like China Mobile, is what you'll find is you go in and say, okay, I want to buy a phone, I need a new number, and they have two books. They have one book which is really cheap numbers. So it's sort of like they call them Dollar Tree or like a dollar store version of that, which pretty much only, as far as I know, only foreigners use. And those have numbers which are bad. The number four is a nightmare in China. 444, for example, is basically, as far as they're concerned, just means you've cursed someone to death. So you're not going to find someone with a number 444 or something like that on their phone number. Now, what they have is they have another book, which is of good numbers, and those cost a lot more. So if you get the same phone from China Mobile, for example, get an iPhone, for example, but when you decide what number you're going to get to put on the chip, there's the bad book and there's the good book. So what you're going to find is even in things like that, license plates, a classic example, even in Hawaii, is I don't know how much the 888 number goes for, but I know in Hong Kong, 88, I think it's five. I can't remember how many. I think it's five. 88888. That went for, I believe, $300,000 or $400,000. It was actually up for bid when it was available. And the government was perfectly happy to sell that number, but you were gonna have to pay the price for it. With the attitude that driving around with that number in your car meant that not that good things will happen. So it's not luck per se, but it means the potential of luck. So the potential for good things happening is better if you have good numbers. Potential for bad things is more likely if you had bad numbers. So it's not the same as the American concept of luck, of good luck and bad luck, but it's the potential of things good, beneficial, or things negative occurring. Numerology is seen as the key to that. So, for example, if you go to someplace like Hong Kong or Shanghai or someplace like that, you can go to a diviner, and one of the first things they're going to know is they're going to want your driver's license, because the numbers on your license will be interpreted by the diviner, by this numerology system, which is very complicated, into whether basically you've got a good license number or a bad license number. Now, that's not going to make good things or bad things happen, but it means that those things are more likely to happen. Houses, house numbers, the size and measures of a house, whether how many meters each side is, how many meters each room is, are again another form of numerology. So Chinese use this for just about everything. And again, because you're not looking at good luck and bad luck in the way that Americans do, but you're looking at the potential of things happening, then it's people accept this. It's a given. People don't even think about whether it's true or not. Because when you think about it, if it's based on potential, how could you ever prove it one way or the other? Things. Divination, again, tied to numerology. And again, this goes way back, thousands of years in Chinese history. The I Ching is the modern version. Traditionally, this was involved with looking at the shoulder bones of deer, or the the shell of a turtle. And there's actually a way this was done. And we actually have a bunch of bone pieces that actually have, because imperial questions were done this way. Should we do a treaty with so and so? Should we go and attack so and so? And what they do is they ask the question, and then do say shoulder bone of a deer. And there's a ritual you go through, and China being what it is and the bureaucracy being what it is, when it was done, they would actually save the deer shoulder and write both the question that they'd asked and the answer they got on there. So you can actually go and, if you go like to the Shanxi Regional Museum in Xi'an, you can actually see there's literally thousands of these where they actually have, they found pits full of basically the records of questions that rulers asked or important people asked and the answers they thought they got. So again, you have to remember, again, this is very sort of, it's not guaranteed, it's just more likely to happen. This is actually not uncommon. The traditional or classical Greece has this, the oracle, the Delphic oracle, didn't ever give you a direct answer. It sort of said da 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 da, and you could interpret in several ways. Um, and sort of this, that would be closer to the Chinese concept. It's not like you're going to have good things are going to happen tomorrow. It's like, the potential for good things is better tomorrow, maybe. You see this classically in Chinese, architecture, feng shui, with the idea not only of where you put buildings, but also how the buildings are oriented, the way the buildings are laid out, the stuff that you put inside a building and where you put it. All this is part of the idea of feng shui, which is basically the manipulation of, if you would, using numerology to manipulate the land. And part of this is the numerology in all this area also sort of segues into a general concept, the idea of qi. Chinese have a very, very strong concept, and again, it's universal, that life energy exists in all sorts of things. It can exist in particular shapes of land. It can exist in particular plants or animals, certain trees, for example. It exists in people. Anything that has life energy is said to have qi. Now, it's almost exactly the same if you're familiar with the traditional Hawaiian concept of mana. It's exactly the same. It's not the same as the modern concept of mana, which I'm not even sure what that is anymore, to be honest. It spins constantly. But qi is a classic Chinese thing. Now, going back to meditation, that's one of the reasons you meditate. You can acquire qi if you get to your center. The more centered you are, the more you're going to absorb the life energy from things around you. The more distracted or upset, or even if the more positive you are, the more you're going to actually discharge your life energy. So being happy actually means that you're going to lose some of your qi. So again, this idea of change being a constant, and also idea of centrality. So qi is a huge part of this. And numerology, one of the main logics of numerology, is numbers tell you where qi is most likely to be available, if that makes sense. Maybe not, I'm not sure. It does to me, but oh well. And so what you find is all of this sort of gets merged together. So if you go to traditional, or even most modern Chinese homes, you'll find things like red doors and such, which sort of, outsiders sort of go, whoa. But that's because the color red is seen as attraction to qi. And, it's probably in a symbolic sense has to do with the idea of blood and, circulation and life. Green is another color that has qi. In the Chinese system, white is the absence of qi, which is one reason why in the Chinese system, people would never marry with the bride in a white gown. That's basically the color of death. In the Chinese system, you marry in a red gown because that's the color of qi. So a Chinese couple getting married will be in red outfits. So colors, even textures of cloth, are all part of this idea of life energy, because it exists in all sorts of things, including a lot of which, in the Western sense, colors don't have, life energy properties, at least as far as I can remember. But they certainly do in the Asian sense. And so this gets all merged together. So Chinese don't tend to think about where stuff comes from. Again, Chinese are incredibly practical and pragmatic. So since they're convinced that qi is real, since they're convinced that numbers are real, since they're convinced that divination actually works, that then what you do is you just use this. So for example, again, at Chinese New Year's, you put up symbols on the door. These door gods, and these charms, are invariably going to be in red, and that means that the chance of good things happening is embraced and enhanced. You let off loud noises like firecrackers and such to scare away the evil and the bad qi. So, the foods that you eat at Chinese New Year's, again, either have qi in them or attract qi. So this is central to Chinese beliefs. It's not part of the specific religions per se, but the religions have sort of resigned themselves, I guess is one way to put it, to dealing with this as a reality because Chinese aren't going to give up these beliefs. These are central to it. And even the Communist Party, in many cases, maybe avoids having a fight about it, but they don't give people a lot of crap because they do it. They tried to during Mao's period, and that was one of the reasons that the Maoist logic collapsed when he passed away. Is there's just too much change, and people were it was being demanded that people give up too much that they believed in, and they didn't see alternatives as being realistic, I guess, for lack of a better term. Okay, wait here. Okay, so do some visuals here. This again, now we're back at the Forbidden City or the Purple City in Beijing. This is probably the most important part of the Forbidden City. People don't tend to think about it much unless they're, even most Chinese don't. But you know, the palaces and such like that only function because of this structure. This is a fascinating example. Now we know that there were examples in other cities. We don't know where they were. The guys that I'm working with in Xi'an are still trying to find where the Tang Dynasty circular temple complex would be. It should be somewhere in the north part of the city, but no one's found it. And maybe it was intentionally torn out. Who knows? So this basically looks like a wedding cake. It's a layered thing with steps. So it's circular. There's the first tier, second tier, third tier. Now, what you find is if you remember that guy that was doing the calligraphy, and behind him there was that big promenade walkway with marble, sort of, tracks in it. This is where those lead. They lead to this. Now, this particular temple only got used once a year. This was used at Chinese New Year's. And what would happen is the imperial entourage would come marching up from the palaces. They would burn incense and give offerings to the ancestors at that ancestral temple. And then they would come up here. And when they came up here, there was a whole complex hierarchy of who got into which step and such like that. And on the top step, all you would see would be, I know the Empress was up there, up the side here, but I can't remember who else, only 3 or 4 folks. Everyone else was down on lower tiers or outside here. And here's where they do the ceremony to tie the emperor, because you have to remember the living emperor was seen as a manifestation, or if you would, was seen as having a direct link with the Jade Emperor in heaven. So what they would do is they'd have a big ceremony here. The ceremony would start here. And it would end here. Now, this is the top of that circular sort of structure, that platform. And what you see here is a big marble button. Now it's become a tourist attraction. So now people stand on this, but even the emperor would have never actually stood on this, say 100 years ago. What you would have is a ceremony. There'd be a set of incense things on the side. The emperor would come up and give offerings and place the offerings. I think the offerings got placed on two ba that were on either side here, two big containers. I don't think anything actually went on the button. But in the Chinese logic, this button is the point of congruence between heaven, sort of up above wherever it is, and Earth. So for not only all of China, but for all of the planet Earth, within that subset, the subset of China, within that subset, the imperial capital in Beijing, within that subset, the imperial palaces at the Purple or Forbidden City, this was the point of connection with all that. So once a year, the emperor would come over here, give offerings, and basically, if you would, have a direct line connection to the Jade Emperor in heaven. And he would then have theoretically a conversation with the Jade Emperor. The Jade Emperor would say, well, you're doing a good job, or well, you're doing a crappy job. You're not going to be around next year. Who knows what they would say. But the end result of all that would be that this was the point of connection. So there was actually a physical location tying heaven to earth. And this was it. This button was it, which is why, over 100 years ago, if this guy had been sitting here, one, the Imperial Guards would have taken his head off in a second. Secondly, I'm willing to bet that almost everyone who was Chinese would have waited for either some bolt of heaven or something else to come down to actually turn him into a little French fry, because he's actually having the temerity to stand on this particular location. So again, it's a tourist thing now, but when you look at it, It's a fascinating example of how the Chinese tie in the idea of physical locality, because this thing wasn't there happenstance. It was done there. God knows how many diviners did how much numerology to figure out the exact location of where this should be for it to be the best connection point, if you would, the best star link between, the heavenly emperor and the earth emperor. So it's a fascinating example of this. And this, again, this would be done by Taoist priests in the last, 1500, 2000 years, but it was part of the system way before that. We don't know in the earlier dynasties if they actually had some place that like this particular button, but they, from what we understand, is they have locations like this. Um, this is an example of Taoism. Taoism sort of isn't Taoism, but it actually predates Taoism. This is my wife's family's village in Zhongshan, a village in Zhongshan. And this is the central ancestral temple. There's three, maybe only three clans in the village. But they all share this temple, though my wife's clan is sort of their main hangout. So if you're doing this near New Year's, so notice here's your New Year's paper, here's your good luck paper. There's writing on here, basically prayers. And what you have is this whole thing is set up to make ancestors happy. So what you do is you burn incense here, you go inside and you say hello to the ancestors, give them offerings, PR them, because you have to remember ancestors aren't dead. Ancestors are still involved in keeping track of what their descendants are doing. So that's one reason why even in a little village, this will be nice and clean, because you don't want to have the ancestors pissed off at you. Now, this is from about 15 years ago. But things have never changed. I mean, this is the way it is. So on one hand, if you look at an archaeological or a cultural report, they'd say that the government would say this is a Taoist temple. There really isn't. It's an ancestral temple, which isn't quite the same thing. This isn't the main one. The main family's ancestral temple, I'm not sure exactly where it's at. It's something somewhere in northern Guangdong. Uh, it's not in Guangzhou. I'm not sure exactly where, because they're a South Chinese or Southeast Chinese clan. But what you're going to find is there's going to be a pretty massive, huge temple somewhere that on the outside is going to look Taoist. It's oftentimes going to be called Taoist, but the reality is it's the hangout for that particular clan. It's where the original clan ancestor is. Now, clan ancestors can be multiple places at the same time. So on one hand, while the ancestor's there, the ancestor's also monitoring what's going on here. So if you would, they have like an ancestral version of security cameras or something going on. So when people leave offerings, they keep track of that. Now, what they're also doing is keeping track of the folks that don't leave offerings. So as you can envision, that goes back to this whole idea of qi and of yin and yang and such like that. Ancestors have the ability to give and take qi. In fact, for most folks in China, ancestors is the main way that you get qi. So, you piss off an ancestor and all of a sudden you're going to find yourself getting tired a lot. Things aren't going to go well for you. And everyone's going to be sort of like, well, gee, I wonder what caused that. So it's not going to be subtle. Let's see if the next one flips it. Okay. Now, what you also get, and this is a classic example of sort of pre-Taoist logic, is this is actually a land god shrine. So what you're going to find in any village in China is there's going to be spots that have something. They can be a little box, a tiny, structure, whatever it is. And that's where they're seen as gods that actually live around here within I don't know, maybe like a 500-meter radius. And they actually are, one of the things they do is they manipulate qi in this particular landscape. So, for example, in the family's village, I think there's 7, as I remember, land god shrines. Now, on one hand, they're sort of subordinate to that one I showed you earlier, that just showed you of the family or clan shrine. On the other hand, these are actually sort of autonomous. So again, you're gonna PR these. You're gonna generally, unless you're really committed, you probably would only consistently give offerings and burn incense at the ones in the immediate vicinity of your house or where your field, your planting, your agriculture, since most of these folks are farmers, where their fields are at. The other ones you only maybe do at New Year's or something like that. As you can see, this one doesn't get as much attention because the panel, the good luck panels, the good fortune panels look like they're about a year old. So this one's not getting as much attention as the clan shrine. Again, this predates Taoism. Again, the idea is that Qi is in the landscape, and land gods, like clan ancestors, can manipulate and modify Qi within their jurisdiction, within their area of responsibility. And so you want to PR these guys. Now, again, this would be seen technically by the government as part of a Taoist belief system, but it's really not Taoist. It's something older. It's something that's still very much part of the Chinese logic, but it's definitely part of this whole system. So we'll finish up by getting started on Taoism. Taoism in its sort of seems strange to talk about 2,000 years old as its modern version, but certainly that would be sort of the way it plays out. Is this intellectual form of Taoism, which is the Lao Tzu's writings, the Tao, the way. And so it's a philosophy of nature. It embraced and incorporated pre-existing shamanistic systems or pre-existing belief systems that existed in China that he just sort of incorporated into his, sort of philosophy of, I suppose, sort of a philosophy of religion. He didn't really think of it as religion per se. And so again, as I mentioned earlier, there's like two forms of Taoism. There's popularistic Taoism, of which those, the little land temples we saw would be examples. And to actually also that button in the imperial capital that was used by the Qing dynasty would be actually popularistic Taoism. On the other hand, there's intellectual or philosophical Taoism. Now, if you're into Chinese wushu or martial arts, that's actually part of this intellectual philosophical Taoism. So Daiji, Qigong, all these types of martial arts exercises on the idea of movement to improve the flow of Qi in the body. The idea that you meditate to improve your, intellectual, but also your sort of, position and place in the universe. This is part of the intellectual Taoism, which is very much what Lao Tzu is writing about, way back in the day. And the two really don't have much in common. Intellectual philosophical Taoism is pretty universal in the sense that no matter where you go in China, it's the same thing. Popularistic Taoism varies tremendously from place to place. In Zhongshan, which is near Guangzhou, in Guangdong province, where the family's from, their versions of popularistic Taoism are in many ways almost entirely different than the Taoism I see if we're at a village in, say, Zunyi or something like that outside of Xi'an in Shanxi province in west, central western China, far to the north. Very, very, very different. So what you're going to find is based on where you are, based on the group that you're with, they can have beliefs that are, pretty radically different. And very frequently, these can also sort of change over time. So, based on political, social change, who knows what else, new things might be absorbed into popularistic Taoism, and other things might just sort of eventually fade out. So popularistic Taoism is pretty dynamic, to be honest. Intellectual philosophical Taoism is very fixed because it's based on a written philosophical set of texts, the most famous being that of Lao Tzu. So, yeah, very, very different systems. And it's sort of got to be a source of enormous confusion to folks when they first get involved in Chinese religions to have all this label of one term when they really don't have much of anything in common, except, sort of basic logics of the idea of Qi and such like that. One of the things that it is an immediate indicator of intellectual philosophical Taoism is this orientation towards medicine and alchemy. and I suppose to a certain extent chemistry. One of the big things that these folks were into, well, I'm not sure they're still into it now. Well, they are with meditation, but for the longest time, right into say a century ago, was the idea that you could actually make an elixir that would give people immortality. Now, what you find is popularistic Taoism, in the sense of the sort of localized versions, is also really big on this idea of elixir of immortality. You see this classic, in which very confusingly is called Tibetan Buddhism, which is actually very Taoist, because among other things, Tibetan Buddhism is really big on trying to find elixirs of immortality. And you'll constantly bump into folks who are like, oh, this particular lama has been around for 300 years because he knows how to manipulate his chi. That's actually very Taoist. In the Buddhist system, no one, in Buddhist theology, no one would be interested in how long you've been around. That's got nothing to do with Buddhism, but it does with this idea of Taoism. So Taoism was very frequently involved in this. What you find is in traditional Chinese sort of social value systems, is folks that were intellectuals that didn't want to get involved in the bureaucracy would frequently become Taoist intellectuals, and among other things, might actually go off for a year or two to meditate in the mountains somewhere, such like this. You see this a lot with Chinese art images. And so the idea that you actually would take like a leave of absence, I guess, or a sabbatical, and try to find your center, develop your chi, is very much out of the Taoist logic. And this would be for intellectuals or folks that were educated. This is obviously this intellectual philosophical Taoism, and that actually scored you points. If you had failed, for example, in getting into the bureaucracy, if you'd failed the exams, then rather than just trying again next year, which people still do in Japan, in China, what you would do is you'd take some time off, and you might very well take a year or two off, develop your calligraphy, develop your poetry, and also spend a lot of time meditating somewhere like in the mountains or on a lake or something like that, with the idea that you're going to center yourself. You then come back, and not only would there be a general assumption you're going to do better on the exams, but also when it comes to sort of like filling out your resume, the guys in the government, which are looking like, okay, this guy's passed the exam, where we're going to put him. The fact that you've done these things, these Taoist, precepts, would actually score you points in terms of being someone who is demonstrably, got their act together. So Taoism is an interesting system, because you just got to remember that there's two different things that have the same label, and they've really, for our purposes in this class, they got nothing in common except someone gave them one label. Not surprisingly, since we've already gone over this a bunch, Taoism is really big on the control of qi, uh, food, meditation, exercise, you name it. And a lot of this, again, you see us a lot in Hawaii, but I'm not sure people really understand the sort of underpinning logic behind the whole thing. The idea of qi or mana, Hawaiians actually had a very similar idea in terms of how you acquired mana, because again, like their Chinese counterpart, mana in the Hawaiian system was largely given by ancestors, but it was also given by place and by the things that you did. Hawaiians didn't have the same concept of meditation as a complex philosophical practice, because you don't have that whole set of written texts that basically train you in that. But to a certain extent, training in Hawaiian arts, especially martial arts, was a way to acquire mana. So a lot of this in terms of intellectual exercises, learning new things in traditional Hawaii, was the acquisition of mana. So a lot of this is very, very similar, which again, as I've mentioned a bunch of times before, was one reason why when Chinese move here, they find that it's a lot easier for them to sort of logic or understand the Hawaiian belief system than they would the American one, which they just is like, in many cases, almost like the antithesis of each other. Not surprisingly, since the landscape and things in the landscape have life energy in them, then you want to be in harmony with nature. You don't want to be, basically bulldozing it or just sort of getting rid of it. You're not in competition. There's no idea of controlling nature, dominating nature. Just the opposite. There's the idea of the transitory nature of existence. People are born, people live, people die. And then there's cycles of existence. So the idea that you You want to have a good life. Um, I don't know if the Chinese don't have a term for that. But the idea that you should have good things happening to you if you're a good person. Chinese would just not. They just don't see the world that way. All the good things that happen to you, and sadly enough, all the bad things that happen to you are just part of the nature of existence. It's nature just is. You exist within nature, but you have no way to control nature. Um, this idea of centrality is also this idea of emptiness. You can't put things in a cup if the cup is full. You can't put chi into a body if the body's full of chi. So what you do is you empty your energies, empty your emotions, and that actually gives you space to then bring in chi. So as we see when we get to Japan, this is very similar to what you see in Shinto. And so, Chan meditation, which becomes called Zen in Japan, uh, is obviously, entirely, even though it's a Buddhist logic, it's entirely grounded in Taoist belief systems. Okay, so let's talk with that.